It's not a purely academic sort of research-based text. It includes poetry, it includes memoir, it's multilingual, it's in English and Spanish, and even a bit of Nahuatl, which is an indigenous language. It's really a work of art, a work of healing, and it's an offering to people everywhere who are living through complexity and conflict. And when you read the introduction and the editor's note, those are not written by Anzaldua herself, but they offer some really great context to help you understand the piece and the tremendous impact that it's had on artists and activists and educators over the past 30 years. And then I've given you the preface and the first 2 chapters of the book itself, which is Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera. And if you do not understand any Spanish, you can absolutely still appreciate and understand the piece. In fact, I think that she intentionally creates the experience of that language barrier, but also the experience of multiple languages coexisting, right? She's recreating the sound of South Texas, where she grew up, and really the sound of many parts of the U.S. where English is not the only or even primary spoken language. So you are welcome to seek out translations if you are interested, but it's not necessary. And for those of you who do speak Spanish, I hope you enjoy the artistry of the way that she weaves together the various languages. And keep in mind, it's not just Spanish in general, right? She's often referencing a very particular dialect of South Texan Spanish, so you might not even be able to Google all of it. So Anzaldua's work challenges my understanding of America because she challenges the fixed nature of national borders, and she reveals the existence of what she calls the borderlands, right? The land on either side of any border that creates a sort of third space that's neither totally like one side or totally like the other. And she's not speaking abstractly, right? She's talking very specifically about her own experience growing up in South Texas, right on the border between the US and Mexico. So she's saying, right, that her experience was of living in a sort of borderlands, neither just the US nor just Mexico, but this sort of overlapping combination of the two. And I think my favorite part of this reading is when she tells the history of her people to reveal, right, how the US-Mexico border that we are used to today has evolved over time, and how people have mixed and moved back and forth across these lands that are now imagined as a rigidly divided border. So I'm actually going to try to draw a little map here for you guys, because I think this is so visual that it's at least helpful for me to think of it, right, actually with reference to an actual map. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so let's say this is the US, this is the Pacific Ocean over here, so this is today's California, right? And then this is the Gulf of Mexico. This is today's Mexico. And then this is sort of the Rio Grande River. So this is today's Texas. So this is the contemporary border, right, between the US and Mexico. And we're like over here in Newark, right? All right. So she starts actually thousands of years ago. She goes back to her Indian ancestors. She uses the term Indian. The Aztecs specifically, right, who she says inhabited this area here, right, that's now the southwestern United States. And then she says they migrated south to what is now Mexico. So she's saying her ancestors, right, started on quote-unquote this side of the border thousands of years ago. Of course, this border didn't exist at that point in time, right? But then they migrate south, and then the Spanish, right, coming from Europe, conquer this area. They conquer the Aztecs, and so this becomes a Spanish colony, and the Spanish, right, massacre the majority of, or a good number of the Aztecs. Many other die from disease, but they also, for those who survived, right, mix and form mixed families. And so she says this is the origins of the Chicano people, right? Is this mix of sort of the Aztec plus the Spanish, right? Which she says creates the Chicano people, right? So the Aztec influence, the Spanish influence, and so this is how you get the people called Chicanos. And then she says these Chicanos, many of them end up kind of migrating back up here, but they're no longer just Aztecs, they are now, right, Chicanos. And this is when this is all still, part of Spain, right? Oh no. Okay, here we go. All right, so we've got Chicanos all up in here. And then, right, Mexico gains its independence. So now this is all Mexico. So we're talking about the early 1800s. This, basically, this is Mexico. All of this is now the newly independent nation of Mexico. And, of course, also recently having gained its independence from the British is the United States of America. So we have this border right now up here between the relatively new nations of the United States and of Mexico. And so then, right, you have in the early 1800s English American settlers from the US that cross this border, right? She says illegally, so that she's kind of playing on the accusations of Mexicans illegally migrating. She says, well, actually, Anglo settlers, quote unquote, illegally migrated into Mexico, in particular, Tejas, or Texas, as it's known in English. And this eventually forces a war between the US and Mexico called the Mexican-American War in the 19th century. And the result of this war, Mexico loses the war and is forced to sell a huge chunk of its territory to the United States. And so all of this territory, which was once Mexico, then becomes part of the US. So now Mexico starts all the way down here, and we add California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, right? These are all the states that they ultimately become states over time, and all of them basically were formerly part of Mexico. And so now this border moves hundreds of miles south, right? As a result of this war. And just to give you a sense of proportion, right, this was like a quarter of the country, right? This is like 25% of the continental United States, right? That was formerly Mexico that then becomes part of the United States. And so the most important insight to me that Anzaldua gives us from this entire kind of history is that her family is one of many Mexican families who lived here, right, before this war, right? And so if you're a family like Anzaldua's living in South Texas, right, you were living in a nation called Mexico one day, and then this war happens, and now you're living in a nation called the United States. And you didn't move, right? The border moved, right? The border between the nations moved. And so if we take that insight and then right, Anzaldua then uses that insight essentially to critique the racism, right, that she experienced growing up in South Texas as a Chicana person. So, right, the racism, the anti-Mexican racism, right, that she says was rampant in southern Texas when she was a child, right, that sort of racism says that Mexicans are outsiders, foreigners, invaders, un-American, right, that this is a white country, a white nation. Well, that whole idea is based on erasing this whole history of migration and conquest and settlement and war, right? That racism is based on pretending that these nations called the US and called Mexico have always existed in the same place forever, and that this border between them has always existed in the same place forever. and that therefore Mexicans are people from a totally different country, right, that have come into our country. When really, as Anzaldua shows, sometimes, yes, people have crossed borders, but many times borders have crossed people. And so it's actually impossible to rigidly separate Mexico and America, because nearly a quarter of the United States of America was literally, right, taken from Mexico. Not that, a couple hundred years ago. And so Anzaldua's big idea, what she calls borderlands theory, is that this border, right, this is where it is currently, it doesn't actually divide two distinct cultures or societies or nations, but rather it produces this sort of borderland area, right? She might say, like, this is all the borderland, right? This area on either side of this border, in which cultures, right, of both sides are mixed, are mingled, right? There are new hybrid cultural forms, right, that are created through this, right, mixing. And she's not just talking about things like Tex-Mex cuisine, although arguably that could be an example, but she's also talking about a sort of consciousness that arises from living in, right, and along the border. How the experience of living in the borderland gives people the ability to see through these national mythologies and racial mythologies, to see how the US and Mexico are just ideas, right? Two in a series of ideas that have been imposed on this land and the people that inhabit it. And Anzaldua then adds another layer to her borderlands theory by talking not just about physical borderlands in this sense, but also about psychological borderlands, sexual borderlands, spiritual borderlands. She challenges not only the borders between nations, but the borders between genders, between sexualities, between religions. And so she's not simply criticizing sort of white America or the United States and celebrating Chicano culture or Mexican culture and society, right? She's not just trying to flip the sort of racism that she's experienced. She's actually trying to challenge, right, the whole idea, right, of these being two opposing sides. And she's criticizing oppression wherever it appears, right? And however it appears. So while she is highly critical of the racism that she experienced all of her life in the US, she's also highly critical of the patriarchy and homophobia that she experienced within her Chicano community. And she talks about her experiences as a woman who rejected traditional gender roles, as a lesbian who rejected traditional sexual norms. She talks about these experiences of gender and sexuality as another kind of border crossing.